Our next keynote speaker is going to be talking about cultivating integrity, how organizational culture and leadership drive fraud prevention. He is a lecturer at San Diego State University teaching fraud examination and forensic accounting. He's also the CEO, founder of the Fraud Protection Institute, providing anti-fraud training and consulting for organizations. And his resume goes on and on and on. I'd rather talk to him and learn from him. Please welcome Jim Vogt, CEO, founder of Fraud Protection Institute. Jim, am I saying your last name correct? Vogt?
It's actually pronounced Vogt.
Vogt, okay.
Just
like
we.
John Vogt, Vogt.
Exactly. I understand. And Vogt basketballs.
Well, welcome, Jim. Very excited to have you here today. So again, as our attendees are listening to your keynote session, I encourage them to send me questions or just throw it into the chat box for that matter, and I will field those at the end of your session. So it's all about how organizational culture and leadership drive fraud prevention. Fraud is everywhere out there. Let's talk about it, Jim.
All right. Well, hopefully the correct slide view is showing here. But what we want to talk about today, I mean, we often talk about leadership and culture and just the environment in an organization. But what we often don't do is speak about it in the context of fraud prevention, of fraud deterrence, of fraud detection. And so that's what we're going to try to do today, is to talk about culture and leadership and how it can influence and help us in these areas. All right, so what I want to cover in the next 25 minutes is to talk about how leadership helps us and the role that leadership plays in fraud prevention, and how a good, strong culture, a good, strong ethical culture helps us as an organization. Another thing that we'll talk briefly about is the importance of training our teams, our employees, our board members, and everyone else in fraud awareness. And then we'll wrap up with some closing thoughts and the opportunity to ask questions as you indicated. So I think the first thing that I want to establish is, well, why is this important? Why are we even having this discussion? I think it's surprising, as financial professionals, it might seem like a silly question to many of you, but what I've found throughout my practice and throughout my conversations with financial professionals, CFOs, and a number of individuals, is that fraud is surprisingly underemphasized in organizations. Sometimes there's this certain level of, it's hard to put a label on it, a certain level of naivete, or the certain level of, well, yes, we know that this fraud happens, but not in our organization. We've got a good team, and sometimes this creates some issues. Well, just to put this, I think, into context, we see on the screen now, you see the number, you see the figure 5%. Well, what is that indicative of? Well, 5% is the estimate that certified fraud examiners around the globe place on what the average organization loses off their bottom line to fraud every year, 5% of their bottom line. And that it may or may not seem significant, but when you apply this to the gross world product, basically we're talking about a $5 trillion global problem. So it's significant. And if we break it down further, we're talking about an average of more than $1.5 million per case that's reported in the report to the nations by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, that the average fraud lasts 12 months, that of the 1,900 cases that were reported, which is just not even the tip of the iceberg, we're talking about $3.1 billion in losses. And so that 5% comes straight off the bottom line. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir as financial professionals, but if a company has $1.5 million loss, which again is the average, well, how much revenue do they need to replace that? Well, if they've got a 10% profit margin, they need $15 million of additional revenue to replace that loss. And so it is a significant problem. And I think it's something that is definitely worthy of our attention. So that, I think, hopefully answers the question of why. The next question, though, is what does culture have to do with this? How does company culture contribute to how we look at fraud? And organizations are living, breathing organisms, and so each organization has a personality, so to speak. And so what we want to talk about is, well, how does this culture, how does the leadership influence the fraud landscape? And when I say fraud landscape, we're talking about basically that personality or culture of the organization either can work with us or it can work against us as we try to fight against fraud in our organizations. But what I want to look at is to help put this into a framework is to talk for a minute about human nature. And what I mean here is a number of years ago, a study was done that measured or estimated, assessed employee honesty. And this diagram is indicative of the results. And basically what we found, unfortunately, that about 30% of employees are dishonest. They're essentially going to be, they lack a personal code of conduct. They're essentially going to be dishonest or cheat us as soon as at any opportunity they have. And so what happens is that it doesn't matter what our policies are. It doesn't matter what our code of ethics are to these individuals, right? That's not what drives these individuals. So for us, what we want to do is try to keep these individuals out of the organization, obviously. On the other end of the spectrum, we have another 30% or so that represent those individuals that are going to be honest regardless of the circumstances. They have their own strong personal code of conduct, and these are individuals who demonstrate integrity, who are going to be honest regardless of the situations that they find themselves within. And generally, these are the individuals oftentimes that have the courage to do what's right, even if it's difficult. These are the ones that will oftentimes stand up and speak out. But where I really want to focus for a moment is on that middle oval here. And this is the largest group. It's about 40% of individuals. And these are the individuals that practice what we call situational ethics. They're situationally honest. So it depends. It depends on how their behavior serves them. And their behavior might be inconsistent depending on the situation. And so here's where we want to focus, because these individuals in the middle are the ones that are most likely to be influenced by the culture, by the environment of the organization, by the leadership and structure and culture of the organization. So this is really where we need to focus. And so to do that, what we want to do is for those honest individuals, we want to reward them. We want to keep them happy. We want to keep them in the organization. The dishonest, as I mentioned, we want to try to keep them out of the organization. This is where strong hiring policies help out, as well as evaluation. But where our primary focus is on that middle, that situationally honest. This is the largest group, and they're going to be the ones that are most influenced by the examples of leadership, by our policies, and by our ethical culture. And so what that ends up creating is what we call the tone at the top. And I found a recent definition of, well, it's a term we often hear, but what's a good description of that? And this particular definition is that the tone at the top is a visible willingness by senior management to let values drive decisions. to prioritize those values above other factors. So its values matter more than anything, including financial results, and to expect all others in the organization to do the same. So it is a position that we're going to behave ethically, and we're going to expect individuals in the organization to behave ethically. So our objective then is to create a culture of honesty, of openness, of assistance to each other, create a positive work environment with a strong code of conduct, not just in writing, but a living code of conduct, and regular communication and training and transparency. These are the objectives. This is what we want to create this type of environment that supports our efforts. So what are the strategies, and how do we accomplish, how does leadership accomplish this? How do we influence the culture in this way? Well, one is to set and maintain and communicate that tone at the top, that, as I've just described, a willingness to have values be above financial results, above other results. But setting and maintaining that's not enough. We've got to communicate that. And more important than anything else is not only to communicate that, but to model it. You know, we've all probably heard our parents, or if we are parents, maybe even found ourselves uttering those famous words, you know, I'll do as I say and not as I do. And unfortunately, a lot of leaders lead in that way. But what matters most is the modeling, right? The behavior of those individuals. Another thing that's important, another strategy that's important, is to have swift and consistent enforcement of policies. We've got to be rapid in addressing issues that come up. There's got to be accountability at all levels. And again, communication is key. And we want to have continuous monitoring of communication and behavior. So what does that look like? It looks like leadership that's visible and vocal. They speak up. That there are policies and ownership of fraud responsibilities. This is really important. If you go into organizations and ask who's responsible for your anti-fraud program or your fraud management program, oftentimes we get a lot of this. Well, it's always someone else. There needs to be ownership of that, and needs to be policies around that. We want to have sound hiring practices. We want to have effective and timely performance evaluations so that we are addressing the poor performers and rewarding the good performers. There has to be active, ongoing fraud brainstorming, which means we need to make sure that we're not afraid to talk about fraud. Don't let fraud be the F word in the organization. Want to have appropriate anti-fraud controls in place, and the daily behaviors that support those controls, that the controls aren't something that are just set and forgotten. And again, we want to have fraud awareness training for everyone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So what we want to do in order to achieve that, management has to exhibit behavior that's consistent with their expectation. They can't say that this is what we expect, but then demonstrate something else, because that undermines everything. They need to be leadership needs to be active in that fraud conversation, in the brainstorming about fraud, and understanding what risks and vulnerabilities the organization faces. Know the exposures that they have. They need to, again, identify the ownership and accountability for the anti-fraud program, so that there's someone that you can go to and say, you're the one that's driving this program. And we will obviously want to try to do everything we can to prevent or deter these incidents from happening, but that we respond to those quickly when they do occur. Now, one of the models that I like to kind of to look at, well, what are the values, or what does it look like to model this kind of ethical maturity? And this is a theory where it's a pyramid, where at the bottom we have personal ethical understanding. This is just every individual's understanding of what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. Above that is, well, how does that perception, how does our system or our understanding of what's right and wrong apply to business situation? How do we apply that to the things that we face daily? The next level up is where we start to really separate individuals, is the level of ethical courage. This is where individuals not only understand the right thing to do, but they're willing to act on that. They're willing to do the right thing, even if it's inconvenient, even if it creates problems for them. And this is really where the whistleblowers step up. But at the very peak of the pyramid is ethical leadership. Ethical leadership is these individuals who not only have the ethical courage, but they're willing to lead and demonstrate and show others what ethical behavior looks like. So I think this is, if we can see this in our leaders, then the people are going to follow that. Our employees are going to follow that. And so just real quickly, and I want to be mindful of our time, I want to talk about just a situation where negative leadership examples really brought a company down. And we all are familiar with Enron. Enron had a toxic competitive culture. We had a very secretive culture where only the people at the top knew what was going on. If you ask Enron, how do you make money? You got this convoluted description. And they had these aggressive practices inside. They had what they called a rank and yank evaluation system, where basically the top 20% were considered A players. The next 70% were kind of middle level players, but the bottom 10% were basically told improve immediately or you're out. And basically what they did is got rid of the bottom 10% every year. And this created a cutthroat environment. There was no collaboration, an environment of fear and unethical behavior to do whatever it took to keep your job. And this is something that it was an example of what not to do. And so what we want to do instead is to go to where we're creating an environment, an element of ethical culture, where the values are clearly communicated. There's no secrets, there's transparency, and everyone understands and sees what the values and principles of the organization are. So open communication channels, and that behaviors are consistent with communication, that leaders aren't saying one thing and doing another. And again, we want to have that regular ethics and fraud training. And what this does is then it creates for us an environment of trust, an environment of transparency. The reality of it is that if an employee feels that they belong, if an employee feels ownership, they're far less likely to do something to harm the organization. They're far less likely to commit fraud. They're far less likely to act unethically. And so this creates a reduced risk of fraud, a reduced risk of ethical misconduct. And it also helps improve employee morale and retention. Again, we want to hold on to those good employees. So how do we go about that? Well, first we need to make sure we have a strong code of conduct, that we develop that and then communicate it. It needs to be a living code of conduct. Again, not something that employees see once, sign and put in a drawer. It needs to be living. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be part of the culture. There needs to be the commitment, involvement of leadership, and that we need to show the regular fraud awareness training. And we'll get to that again in just a second. And so we want to maintain this culture, not just set that expectation, but have regular training to development, regular monitoring and evaluation that helps promote that. And there are two ingredients that are really important to that as well, is that if there's continuous and regular monitoring and evaluation, it creates a perception of detection, meaning that those who might consider behaving unethically think, well, if I do this, I'm likely to be caught. And we want that perception of detection. And number two, we want to have an expectation of punishment, that if an organization, when there's unethical behavior, behaves swiftly or acts swiftly and consistently, there's an expectation that if I behave unethically, I'm going to not only be caught, but I'm going to be punished, that there's going to be consequences. So let's talk about fraud awareness training for a minute, and we'll kind of wrap up with this. So these two numbers, 43%, the average, or 43% points to the number or percentage of frauds that are discovered by tips, but far and away higher than any other method. That fraud situations, fraud schemes are discovered by tips. The 52% represents that over half of those tips come from employees. Well, here's the thing, and this is where fraud awareness training comes in, is we have an expectation in organizations that we want individuals, if you see something, say something. But if our expectations of that exceed the skills that they have to identify that, then it actually becomes a weakness for the organization. And as it turns out, managers, supervisors, employees, they want to be part of the solution, but oftentimes they don't know how. Why? Because we haven't asked them, because we haven't shown them how. In other words, there's no expectation, or there's no support for the expectation that we want them to speak up. And this is where the fraud awareness training comes in. And so we want to have regular fraud awareness training for those individuals, because we can then turn them into fraud fighters or part of our efforts against fraud. So why does this matter? It helps employees recognize and report fraud. It empowers them to act ethically and protects them if they act ethically. And it supports that culture of transparency that we've been talking about that's so important. So some of the key components of this type of training, we need to show them what fraud looks like. We need to show them what are the symptoms, what are the red flags, and then we need to continually update and refresh this. This is not a one and done type effort. We need to do it in an interactive way. I find video training or just simple training where someone watches a video and answers a few questions is least effective. If it's live, if it's interactive and engaging, they're going to take more away from it. And it needs to include real world scenarios and examples that are meaningful to them, that relate to their work. And of course, one of the most important factors is that this type of training, there has to be an anonymous way for them to report anything they see that is that doesn't look right or smell like right. Again, we can do written, we can do tech-based, but I find that live, supported by coaching from their managers or supervisors is of the most greatest benefit. One of the things I think that we can look at too is, well, why don't people speak up? I think it's important, if we're trying to get them to speak up, we have to understand the reasons why they don't. And when we look at that, we look at, I mean, what do we learn when we're small? We learn we don't want to be a tattletale, or it's not my job. It's none of my business. Nobody's ever asked me. And so they're fearful of what might happen, or that they won't fit in. And so understanding these things helps us to address them in this type of training. So we need to assess the organizational needs, develop customized training programs, not even for the entire organization, but for certain parts of the organization, right? The red flags and the symptoms in the payables department might be different than in the payroll department, or in the warehouse, or whatever. So we need to make sure it's customized to the various needs of parts of the organization. We need to measure the effectiveness of the training and make adjustments. So it needs to include all levels of staff. It needs to include the board of directors. It's surprising when polled, board of directors, the majority of board of directors say, no, we've never had any kind of fraud training. Well, isn't it their part of their major responsibility to protect the organization? So we want to make sure that all levels are included. And we want to encourage that feedback and continuous improvement. So to wrap up, I think we want to look at what should leadership do that's going to influence these individuals, influence employees to get the most out of our leadership efforts. And so we have to understand that we're leading by example, that people are watching, just like as parents, our children are watching. Well, as leaders, our employees are watching. We need to lead by example. And this isn't just the leadership at the top, but it's mid-level leadership. We want to foster an open door policy where there's open communication. And I like to even call it an empty seat policy. Leaders should be out of their office and out walking around and making themselves available to employees. We want to recognize and reward ethical behavior. We want to review and update policies and keep them consistent. We want to engage employees in those ethics discussions and create a safe environment for reporting. Because what we want to remember is that engaged, committed employees work with you, but disenfranchised, unhappy employees work against us, or at least in their own interests. So these are the things that I would take away from this. I'd like to open it up for questions.
Jim, that was very informative. We've got about 2 minutes left. We haven't seen any questions just yet, but I have one for you because I talk with Deborah R. Richardson all the time about fraud in her AP world and things of that nature. And you mentioned real world scenarios. Can you give us a real world scenario where you saw like a huge amount of financial fraud?
Oh my gosh, they're in the news every day. But it's funny. One that sticks out in my mind is one I read about a few months ago, and I think it occurred at the end of last year. But it was a newspaper in a relatively small town in Oregon, and there was an employee that embezzled from the organization. And it had gone on for a long time, and it was discovered, and basically it was severe enough that it put the newspaper out of business. They couldn't even pay to print their next issue, and it put that entire that put it out of business. All those individuals lost jobs. There are countless stories like this. Fortunately, the community came in. There were some contributions and some different things that helped out, and they were able to get it back up and running. But we need to be mindful and remember that these things have real consequences. They're not just numbers lost off the bottom line. There are countless examples, but for some reason, that's the first one that popped into my mind.
Well, that was graphic. Like, that is incredible. Again, talking with Deborah and yourself, it's rampant everywhere. It's everywhere you look. For example, I ordered a book online on how to recognize fraud, and I still haven't received it, and it's been a year. Just a little fraud joke.
Yeah, just a little bit.
You got a lot of thumbs up, a lot of hand clapping from the emojis we're seeing on the screen. Obviously, the attendees loved your presentation. Thank you for being our keynote speaker here this afternoon, and very rewarding and very informative.